California, Teamsters Hispanic Caucus. The Human Rights Diversity Commission, on behalf of Director Marcus King, in conjunction with the Teamsters History Project, kindly welcomes you back to this Black History Month segment of our multicultural history program, the modern civil rights movement, a brief and essential history presented by the James R. Hoffa Professor of Modern American Labor History. Our program are designed to examine a wide variety of aspects in our shared past, including events in Black, women, Latinos, AAPI, and LGBTQ plus histories and their impact on Teamsters and labor history. We hope that this segment will generate some robust discussion and ideas for impactful programs and events at your local communities and at home. With that said, please join me in welcoming our very own treasurer and renowned Teamster historian, Karen Jones. Sister.
Karen, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry. Okay, well, I just want to say a brief word about Eric. Eric has been a great partner for us. He has done programs for the Black Caucus, for the Women's Conference, and a variety of other things. He is always welcome or willing to lend a hand. And I just want to say to any of you out there, if you need a speaker or something for a program you're doing at your local or your joint council, get with me and we can see if Eric could possibly be willing to do something for you. He is our James R. Hoffa Teamsters Professor in Modern American Labor History. He also has been at the Woodrow Wilson House and a variety of other areas. He has written 2 books, which, if I am allowed to share my screen, I would like to just put up so that you can see. All right, there we go. It's not working. It's not, there we go. So that you can see the 2 books that he has done. One is Brotherhoods of Color. It is about the Black railroad workers and their struggle for equality. He also has written a book about the waterfront workers in New Orleans, which deals with race, class, and politics. So he is, and he also is currently working on a biography of A. Philip Randolph. So not only is he a good friend to us, but he is a great scholar and he has a lot to offer to us on a wide variety of topics. So with that, I will be quiet and I will take my screen off and let Eric begin his program. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. Give me one moment here. My turn to share my screen. All right, there we go. I want to begin by thanking everyone working on the Teamsters Human Rights and Diversity Commission for all of the programming and other work that they do and for the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon about the modern civil rights movement. Even though this is a subject that I have studied and taught for actually many decades, I will confess at the outset that today's talk is something of a challenge for me. In my US History Since 1945 class, I devote 4 to 5 lectures, 75-minute lectures to this topic. And I'm also teaching a 20th century civil rights course in which I have a full 14 weeks to address the issues that I'm going to be talking about today. Hence my challenge, how to get so much material into a very brief period of time. Second here. So I've got about an hour to explore the emergence and the evolution of the modern civil rights movement, which will cover the years from the mid-50s to the mid-1960s, a decade or so when the movement successfully challenged central aspects of the Jim Crow system of racial subordination. I necessarily have to leave many things out of an incredibly rich and powerful, if at times depressing story. And on this slide that you've got in front of you now, we've got some 9 US postage stamps, each of which, conveniently for my purpose today, commemorates a key moment or development in the movement's history, taking us from the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 through the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And I'll be touching upon a number of these moments in this talk today. But I want to first begin with a simple question. When did the civil rights movement begin? I want to lay out a number of points. Well, what it accomplished, in fact, was the destruction of legalized segregation, the end of the Jim Crow system in the South. I'll get to the timing question in a moment. It involved the end of disfranchisement and the enfranchisement of Black Southerners as voters in that region. The 1965 Voting Rights Act enshrined that into words. And in the words of the political activist and his philosopher Cornel West, the movement's major accomplishments, he once argued, involved the, quote, transformation of everyday life, especially the elimination of terror as a primary mode of social control in much of the South. Now, while violence doesn't disappear, we get too frequent reminders of that in recent days, its prevalence did decline dramatically. And I think that Cornel West's words, his point about violence and day-to-day social control is an apt one. So the question of timing, when did the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, begin? Now, much of what we know about the modern civil rights movement, much of what is common knowledge, to some extent, comes from a wonderful documentary series called Eyes on the Prize. This series offers us, in what we in the history business call the Montgomery to Memphis narrative, a narrative that begins either in 1954 with the Brown v. Board of Education decision or the 1955-56 Montgomery bus boycott, and it extends to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis in 1968. The documentary series, I want to make clear, is an excellent one, and if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it to you. And the framework is reinforced by many books that highlight the role of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And on this slide are 4 volumes by the outstanding journalist historian Taylor Branch. And these books refer to the years from 54, 55 to 68 as the King years. Now, over the past decades, historians have clearly recognized a broader cast of characters whose labors fueled the civil rights movement and whose courage made its victories possible. And here is but a small sample of the many biographies of that larger cast of characters. I would argue that on one level, the Eyes on the Prize and King Years framework does capture many of the key elements in the civil rights story. But I'll also point out that on another level, as historians have suggested, it's also somewhat misleading. Yes, we can argue that the modern civil rights movement began in the 1950s, but note the emphasis into here, my speaking on the word modern. For the civil rights movement didn't simply spring out of nowhere. It didn't come out of the blue. It drew upon a much longer, richer tradition of Black protest and civil rights activism in both the North and the South. And over the years, historians have been substantially transforming, revising our understanding of modern civil rights, finding its roots in the activities of countless activists in the 1930s and 40s, and even earlier. Protest and resistance during and after World War I, for example, activism to free the Scottsboro Boys in the 1930s, the emergence of the National Negro Congress in that decade as well. And the March on Washington movement during World War II, the battle to desegregate the armed forces in the 1940s, these are in some ways just the tip of a much, much larger iceberg. And historians have extended backwards in time their dating of the civil rights movement origins. Some have referred to the 40s as the seed time of civil rights. Others have invoked the phrase the long civil rights movement, arguing that there was a civil rights movement before the civil rights movement that we commonly recognize, and that we can't understand what happens in the mid and late 50s and 60s without understanding what preceded it. And as this slide shows, there's a considerable amount of scholarship on the bookshelves these days that attest to the existence and the importance of these earlier struggles. I could fill up many slides, a good number of them, with the covers of other books exploring this earlier history, but I'll let this single slide stand to represent this new literature. But a question remains: why a new movement? How do we account for its emergence? Well, when the civil rights movement burst into the headlines in the mid-1950s, most white liberals were taken aback or were caught off guard, as my old friend, the historian, not comedian, the historian David Chappelle once noted. Or as another scholar, Richard King, once put it, the civil rights movement was a great surprise. Why? Why did it take until the mid-1950s, and especially the 1960s, for the movement that we recognize today as being responsible for challenging and toppling Jim Crowe to emerge how and when it did? So let me speak briefly to the immediate context that I hope can account for the emergence and the eventual triumph of this movement. First, there was the ideological climate and the international situation. World War II pitted the Allies against fascist powers, which had made racism a core component of its worldview. And in the larger ideological battle, the United States ostensibly opposed racism forcefully, even if it sanctioned a version of it at home. So the war against fascism, in a certain sense, was a war against racism. And racism in the United States, or at least less crude, more respectable variants of it, became, well, I guess the word would be less fashionable. Simultaneously, there are developments in the fields of biology, genetics, and anthropology that led to a questioning of the notion of racial hierarchies and even the concept of race itself as a biological fact. This is not to say that racial ideologies had vanished, far from it. You can look at plenty of American newspapers in the 1940s and in the 1950s and see plenty of it. And I should point out, anti-Semitism remained very strong as well. But within limits, I think we can say that racist ideologies were beginning to lose some of their purchase, at least in some white circles. And this is a process that didn't just happen automatically. It wasn't simply a logical process whereby opposition to fascism abroad translated neatly or automatically into opposition to racism at home. It was the product of concerted pressure by African Americans and their allies. The slogan double V, victory over fascism abroad, victory over racism at home, during the Second World War captured the spirit and the efforts of activists who insisted that the war was being fought on multiple fronts, overseas, yes, but also here at home as well. These efforts during the 40s did not overturn the racial order, but they did contribute to something of a shift in perspective, a delegitimizing in some circles of both racist practices and ideologies. And then there was the international situation. The Cold War and the struggle for international domination didn't simply play out in Europe. It had global ramifications, yes. From the late 40s onward, European empires were under attack from within, from peoples of color in Asia and Africa demanding their independence. But if and when they would achieve it, the next question was straightforward. With which bloc, or would they ally themselves? Would it be the communist bloc or the Western non-communist bloc? And this was no small matter. It loomed extremely large in the thinking of both the Soviets and the Americans, both of which sought to win the favor of independence movements in what was becoming a global Cold War. But what did the United States have to offer these folks? It portrayed itself as the opposite of the Soviet Union in many ways. It represented what American officials called the free world, and it touted representative democracy and other freedoms. But the Soviets responded, what freedoms? The United States deprived peoples of color within its borders of basic civil, political, and human rights. And the Soviets paid close attention to the unfolding civil rights movement and the often violent responses to it. Lynchings, race riots, and the like provided the communist bloc with fuel for their propaganda fire. Racism in the United States was, quote unquote, exploited by the Soviet Union, or rather, it was pointed out and highlighted as a means of undercutting American claims to ideological superiority and of bolstering Soviet claims that they were championing the interests of exploited people everywhere. And they didn't have to try that hard on this front, for racial segregation, violence, and blatantly discriminatory practices were staple elements of American life. And it turned out these reflected quite negatively on the US, weakening its claim to be a defender and the bastion of democracy. Now, this context allowed civil rights activists to make an argument, and actually to make a pretty effective argument, that discrimination, racism hurt the United States in its struggle with the Soviet bloc, and that the struggle for civil rights was a democratic and patriotic struggle. So they absorb Cold War rhetoric and thinking into their rhetorical arsenal, and they deploy it like a weapon against Jim Crowe. And what made this bad publicity particularly consequential was that it's occurring in the context of decolonization, as millions of non-white peoples in Asia and Africa are, quote, part of the revolt of the colored peoples of the world against the old ideas and practices of white supremacy. Or as James Baldwin once poignantly put it, all of Africa will be free before we can get a lousy cup of coffee. So in the competition for influence and for power abroad, America's internal racism won the country few friends. And that meant that political leaders were increasingly, what's the word, sensitive to the race question, recognizing that, quote unquote, leaving things alone in the South had international implications in the fight against communism. Then there was the role of mass media. The modern civil rights movement emerged at a time of the maturation of mass culture and essentially the rise of television. This means that the movement can project itself outward to the entire country, indeed the world. It could render the invisible visible and make it harder to ignore. The terrors of daily life could become something that all Americans could see, and potentially it could stir the conscience of the nation. So the brutality that Black Southerners experienced regularly could now be made crystal clear to the rest of the country. The photographs, the television footage showed Southern white policemen and white mobs attacking nonviolent Black protesters who were demanding not revolutionary change, but simply the rights supposedly granted to all Americans. So that's how I see the context, the setting of the stage for the modern movement. And I want to take us quickly through the various stages of the movement's history. We begin with the breaking of legal ground by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. By the 1950s, the NAACP wasn't a mass movement. Its staff largely relied upon lobbying and legal action. They pursued a strategy of litigation. They took aim at racial segregation, the notion of separate but equal, that in reality was separate and unequal in its multiple forms. This system is ubiquitous. It's extensive. It governs virtually all aspects of public life in the South, requiring segregated seating and streetcars, railroads, buses, railway stations, separate drinking fountains, separate schools and parks, and so forth and so on. And the NAACP targets the realm of public education. And it turns out that's where it ultimately proved to be most vulnerable. The court case that shocked the nation and to a degree placed race squarely and unavoidably on the political agenda was Brown v. Board of Education, a landmark case in the 20th century, decided in '54. On May 17th of that year, the court issued its rather surprising ruling. In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, it declared. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Any language in Plessy v. Ferguson, a Supreme Court case that sanctioned segregation from 1896, any language in Plessy contrary to these findings, the court said, is rejected. Boom. School segregation banned, read one headline. School segregation outlawed, read another. The North Carolina Statesville Record and Landmark put it this way: the unanimous decision was a sweeping victory for Negroes and was, quote, perhaps the most important U.S. race relations decision since the famous Dred Scott decision of 1857, which held that Negroes were not citizens. Now the court had concluded that segregation represented a, quote, denial of equal protection of law, and it added that the court's 12-page ruling would rank in sociological significance with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The African-American weekly, the Chicago Tribune, would not have disagreed. It described the ruling as a prelude to that eventual complete emancipation of the Negro in America. For the moment, it only applied to education, but it would be a matter of time, it predicted, before this decision would be used as a weapon to attack Jim Crowe everywhere. That part was indeed true, and it's precisely what white Southerners feared. The Black weekly, the California Eagle, called Brown a victory for democracy. The court had righted an historic wrong, a wrong that has done untold harm to America. Historians had said, looking back at our time in this location will undoubtedly mark May 17th, 1954, as the day when segregation was dealt a mortal blow. Well, did Brown do that? Had it dealt segregation a mortal blow? Was it really a prelude to the eventual complete emancipation of the Negro in America? No question, the case was important. That I can't question. Its implications would become clear soon enough, but it had not delivered a fatal blow to segregation, and whether it was a prelude to complete emancipation, well, that is a matter for debate. So what happens? Many white Southerners vowed to draw a line in the proverbial sand and to resist the court ruling at all costs. The ruling means war, shouts Dixie, ran one headline. There were, quote, predictions that human blood may stain Southern soil. The Georgia governor, Eugene Talmadge, suggested calling out the troops to defy the Supreme Court's order. And for his part, President Dwight Eisenhower, similarly, well, he didn't exactly pressure the white South. He condemned extremists on both sides, and he made his preferences clear by stating that I don't believe you can change the hearts of men with laws or decisions. And he added to an aide, I'm convinced that the Supreme Court decision has set back progress in the South 15 years. It's all very well to talk about school integration, he said. If you remember, you may also be talking about social disintegration. Feelings are deep on this, he said, and the fellow who tries to tell you that you can do these things by force is just plain nuts. White Southerners launched a massive resistance campaign. As long as we can legislate, they argued, we can segregate. And they legislated and they segregated. Southern states passed some 450 new laws aimed at limiting, restricting desegregation. Citizens' councils, composed of the region's so-called best white men, were formed in most Southern cities with the express purpose of stopping school desegregation and Black gains. They resorted to propaganda, economic pressure, violence, terror, intimidation. African Americans would be denied loans. Those who had been involved in civil rights activity could be thrown off the land. Those holding public jobs like teachers could be fired. And they pursued the NAACP with a vengeance, effectively putting it out of business, at least temporarily, in many states. As one academic put it years ago, a reign of white terror was hurled against proponents of Black freedom between 1955 and 1959. It's in this context, one of massive white resistance to the Brown decision and any and all civil rights initiatives, that the Montgomery bus boycott burst onto the scenes in late 1955 and 1956. The boycott has been long enveloped in mythology. You might have encountered it in high school history classes or in popular culture. As the story goes, a tired Rosa Parks one day was simply too weary to give up her seat when ordered to do so by a white bus driver in Montgomery, Alabama in December of 1955. That's the popular version, and it's misleading. Take the observation of the historian of civil rights, Charles Payne. The portrait of Rosa Parks as some simple woman who accidentally got caught up in great historical events is a complete distortion, he wrote. She had spent her adult life looking for ways to make a difference. She had joined the NAACP. She became its secretary. She had worked on voter registration campaigns. And I'll add, in the age of digitization, the ability to find Rosa Parks in the historical record is one that is much easier than it used to be. You can literally go through newspaper databases and find her, accounts of her activities, articles that she herself authored prior to her emergence at this particular moment. She was an activist embedded in a larger activist world prior to her stepping on the national stage with that decision to not give up her seat in December of 55. And so the bottom line here, and I'm advancing no novel point, is that Rosa Parks didn't come out of nowhere. She wasn't just tired. She had years of political activism under her belt. And if this particular act hadn't been planned in advance, it nonetheless drew upon a wealth of experience as a civil rights leader and from decades of anger and resentment over the treatment of African Americans in the South. So what actually happened? The Alabama Journal, published in Montgomery, carried two articles, December 2nd, December 3rd. The first simply states that Rosa Parks, an employee at a downtown department store, was jailed for violating segregation laws by refusing to accept the seat assigned to her by a Montgomery City Lines bus driver. As the bus filled up, the driver ordered a number of Black passengers to relinquish their seats for whites who had boarded. Parks refused. I had been pushed as far as I could stand to be pushed, she later recounted. It hadn't been her intention that day to protest, but she did. She was arrested. The arrest became the occasion for the launching of a boycott that embraced most of Black Montgomery for a year. The cast of characters was large. A key player was E.D. Nixon, the head of the local NAACP, a longtime colleague and ally of Parks, and a leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And of course, there was that relative newcomer to Montgomery, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who was selected to run the organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, which would oversee the boycott of the city's buses and the city's downtown white retail stores. The boycott proved remarkably successful. It involved directly or indirectly most of the city's Black community, which displayed a remarkable discipline and solidarity. For over a year, 90-some-odd% of Black Montgomery stayed off the buses. And white Montgomery responded with vengeance. King's home was dynamited. The Montgomery Improvement Association moved its headquarters 4 times because of harassment. The city arrested Blacks as alleged hitchhikers on trumped-up vagrancy charges. King and others were arrested for speeding. Legal and physical harassment continued. The boycott remained intact. Money poured in from civic, religious, and labor groups from around the country. And as for coverage of the events of that year, just take a quick look at this slide, which comes from the monthly newspaper of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And the focus is on E.D. Nixon, the NAACP leader and the president of the Brotherhood's chapter in Montgomery. In the eyes of this Black union, the driving force behind the boycott was their member, Nixon. You can't see it on this slide, but the paper does recognize a Dr. King, whose home is also bombed. You can see it on this slide, however, but it refers to him as L.M. King. It got his initials mixed up. They wouldn't repeat that mistake going forward. Finally, later in 1956, the US Supreme Court affirmed a decision of the lower court that declared Alabama's laws requiring segregation on buses unconstitutional. The boycotters were victorious. Sporadic violence continued against Black residents, but the first essential battle against Southern segregation had been won. And this year-long boycott catapulted Dr. King into the national spotlight as the premier civil rights leader. And he used his newfound prominence to promote nonviolence and activism around the nation. The immediate question was how to build upon the success in Montgomery. How do you translate one victory into future victories? In 1957, King helped to found a new organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, an association of Black ministers and various civil rights groups in the South. It demanded that the region become more like the rest of the country, and that the rest of the country change too, for that matter. It argued that race must cease to become a defining characteristic before the law and in social life. Black Americans should be treated like all Americans, plain and simple. Now, that's the rhetoric. What's the specifics? They concretely called for an end to segregation, a removal of employment barriers, or an extension of employment opportunities. They called for political rights on an equal opportunity before the law, political equality in a democratic republic. Okay, how do you get from there to here? That's how you frame the goals. King argued and drew upon what he called the amazing universalism of the Declaration of Independence and the American dream, an extension of the rights supposedly guaranteed to all men to actually all people. And King and the SCLC pursued this dream, this amazing universalism, by pursuing a strategy and a philosophy of nonviolence, violent civil disobedience. It was a doctrine that had infused the Montgomery bus boycott. It was drawn from the struggles of Mahatma Gandhi, and the Indian people to free themselves from British colonialism. King took nonviolence to heart. How did the concept work? Nonviolence, he argued, does not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding, to awaken his sense of moral shame in the opponent. Creative nonviolent protest would break down barriers, not build them up. This was called or referred to or understood as nonviolent persuasion. Change hearts and minds through moral argument and behavior. But what happens when it doesn't work that way? It doesn't awaken a sense of moral shame in the opponent when one's opponent responds violently to nonviolence. And as it turned out, one problem with the philosophy of nonviolence at this time was, well, it didn't exactly work in the way that King and others intended it. One could argue, I think fairly easily, that the nonviolent protests of King and others did not succeed in winning the friendship and understanding of the oppressor. It did not awaken a sense of moral shame in the opponent, at least not until a bit later. So not only was the white South not reforming or changing its ways, but if anything, it appeared the opposite was occurring, as the entire machinery of Southern white politics was brought to play to preserve the status quo by legal means if necessary, but always supplemented by violence. So the question remains, how do you accomplish your end? And part of the answer lay in shifting the target audience for nonviolence. Given white intransigence and reaction in the South, the target became forces outside of the region. If nonviolence fails to win over converts and in the hearts of white Southerners, then go after others. Get the federal government involved. And you can do that in part by achieving major favorable news coverage to force the government's hand. But before we get to that, last thought about, for reasons of time, let me just move on right now to 1960. Pursuing the strategy of nonviolence was a handful of Black college students who, in the words of Claiborne Carson, ignited one of the largest of all Afro-American protest movements in early 1960. They sat in on a segregated lunch counter in Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, demanding, well, politely asking to be served. That was the spark. And the sit-ins spread quickly across the South in the weeks that followed. The sit-ins were accompanied by white intransigence, verbal harassment, physical abuse by bystanders and the police. But they spread. Over 50,000 people eventually participated in these sit-ins. And they attracted a considerable amount of support across the country, particularly in the North and West. New allies of the civil rights movement began to picket those companies that denied Black service in the South. And when the flurry of the initial sit-in subsided, Ella Baker of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference concluded that a permanent but independent student organization was needed that could maintain and organize subsequent protests. Thus, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was born in April of 1960. One of its first projects, in conjunction with other civil rights groups, were the Freedom Rides in 1961. The project had been initiated by the Congress on Racial Equality, CORE, with the express purpose of testing Southern segregation laws and train and bus stations. CORE assembled interracial teams of civil rights activists, Black and white. They leave Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1960. They arrive in Alabama. They encounter angry crowds of whites at terminals. Buses are stoned. Participants are beaten and jailed. And this is an iconic photograph of what happened when the Freedom Riders encountered undisguised white hostility. A bus is attacked and firebombed outside of Arnesen, Alabama in May of 1961. Now, the Freedom Rides and the violence attracted considerable national attention, as these articles can give you a hint. As the NAACP's Roy Wilkins put it, an Alabama dictatorship of the mob appears to be as great a menace to America as any foreign threat, unquote. CORE decided to call off the Freedom Rides on the grounds that the danger was too great. But when CORE calls it off, SNCC steps in, and in large numbers, SNCC activists ride buses. They experience similar attacks. Hundreds are arrested. They adopt a jail, no bail strategy. They fill up the jail. The idea is to strain the resources of the state to keep the issue alive. This very difficult experience led to the formation of very intense bonds between the participants. And they kept the issue alive, much to the dismay of the Kennedy administration, which had finally stepped in behind the scenes to regain control of this situation. What did that intervention consist of? The administration was very unhappy with this nationally publicized violence. It called for a cooling off period. Needless to say, the administration is none too pleased with the state of affairs. As the journalist Murray Kempton once put it back in 1961, the Freedom Riders were an inconvenience to established authority. The Attorney General didn't get the moral dimensions of the crisis. It's sad that Robert Kennedy did his best to protect them without understanding just what a precious piece of the legend of America it had fallen to him to defend. A few quick words about Kennedy and civil rights. Historians have noted that Kennedy as a senator, quote, shared none of the passion of the movement, unquote, that had developed during the Montgomery bus boycott. As historians Michael Kazin and Morris Isserman once put it, in the first couple of years of his presidency, the lights did not burn late in the White House while the president fretted over domestic issues. He was focused primarily on foreign affairs. Civil rights was a matter of crisis management rather than, quote, an opportunity to provide political leadership. And activists and civil rights leaders were decidedly unimpressed, underwhelmed by the president's action. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, 6 months into Kennedy's term, noted that Kennedy's refusal to move forward with a civil rights bill in Congress was disappointing. His words were diplomatic, but pointed. The administration has made an error and decided that Kennedy didn't want to have a fight in Congress over the issue, plain and simple. This was not something that Kennedy would do at least until 1960. And as for the Freedom Rides, in the spring of 1961, the unhappy Kennedy administration sought ways of diffusing the crisis. Historian Douglas Field notes that Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, was angry at the Freedom Riders. It came at an inopportune time politically for his brother, the president. So the anger was less at the white Southerners doing the violence, but at the protesters who were at the receiving end. It made Kennedy's look bad. So crisis management. They stepped in to resolve it, to get the issue out of the headlines, to prevent a repeat of it in the future. The solution was to redirect and to control the energies of the civil rights movement, particularly this confrontational wing, directed towards something safer, they hoped. How about voter registration work? They quietly arranged with a number of liberal foundations to provide hundreds of thousands of dollars to carry out voter registration work on the grounds that this would be a safer, quieter course of action. It wouldn't involve public violent confrontations like freedom rides. And as an added bonus, they felt this would bolster the reformist wing of the Democratic Party in the South. Hence, the voter registration project was born that engaged a variety of civil rights groups. SNCC activists who were initially suspicious of the government ultimately decided that they could devote some attention to voter registration work as well as carry out direct action. So that was the idea for the Kennedy administration, but it didn't quite work out that way in practice. So here's the question. Was voter registration work that much safer than sit-ins and freedom rides? Was the contrast between constructive and confrontational activity valid? In practice, the division proved to be artificial. The line separating legitimate voter registration efforts from more radical direct action collapsed because efforts to register new Black voters involved direct action and nonviolent civil disobedience. White registrars, officials, and citizens violently turned back registering Blacks, harassed them, and attacked the organizers. Get a sense from the newspaper of SNCC from 1963. It recounts some arrest of 11 voter registration workers on charges of inciting to riot and refusing to move on after police ordered them to do so. The repression took its toll, and it affected how young civil rights activists on the front lines viewed themselves and viewed the federal government, which did not appear to be their ally. SNCC organizers were arrested and beaten. The FBI stood quietly by, taking notes. This experience embittered frontline activists who felt that the administration had betrayed them and that it was not committed to their struggle. And the experiences of SNCC activists in the South from 1962 to 1964 gave them a very strong sense of identity, created bonds between participants, increased their frustration with the slow pace of change, and it pushed them further to the left. Let me give you an example. The March on Washington in 1963 brought some 250,000 people to the nation's capital in August of that year to protest before the Lincoln Memorial. This was, by this point, the largest demonstration in American history. Chartered buses, trains, planes, countless cars transported unprecedented numbers of Black Americans and white supporters to Washington. And for a brief moment, these nonviolent protesters captured the nation's attention to make the case for civil rights. But not everyone was happy. On the eve of the demonstration, white opponents predicted mayhem and disaster. The Washington Star denounced the march plans as misguided pressure capped by climatic idiocy. The mainstream media warned against the mob spirit, as one magazine put it. The owner of the Washington Post and Newsweek, Agnes Meyer, warned that there would be catastrophic outbreaks of violence, bloodshed, and property damage. And the New York Herald Tribune viewed the march as an attempt to bully Congress, and Congress doesn't like to be bullied. For its part, the Kennedy administration would have preferred no march at all. It feared a major embarrassment. Its efforts might disrupt the Kennedys' moves towards civil rights legislation. We know how things turned out. There was no violence. The march sparked no backlash. It was, most observers concluded, a huge success. And over the years, it's attracted considerable scholarly and popular attention. And today, the march is enshrined in Americans' historical consciousness, understandably so. It's on this day that King delivers his memorable "I Have a Dream" speech, which has been kind of embedded in our national collective memory by popular histories, films, videos, documentaries, history books, museums. It's perhaps the best known moment in the civil rights struggle. In large part, this is what we remember about the march. It was King's March. It's about King's dream, about Black freedom, a sweeping term that embraces demands for an end to segregation in all forms of Jim Crowe and genuine equality before the law. Let me suggest that there's a problem with this rendering, that the king that often gets celebrated for that speech on his birthday in schools during Black History Month is a king that, in my and many historians' reading, who has been removed from history. It's a king that is frozen in time, frozen in August 63 when he delivers the dream speech. Now, on the 50th anniversary of the march, Time magazine had a special issue, and I remember being taken aback by that issue. Its running header read, "One man, one march, one speech, one dream." And I think that phrase sums up what many people think about the March on Washington that day, but it does a genuine disservice to the countless men and women who made the march possible. One could even say there were kind of other marches, there were other speeches, and those organizing them and participating in them had some rather different dreams. Remembering the March for Only King's speech does an injustice to those other dreams. Activists came to DC for many reasons, and one of them was embedded in the title of the march. It's a march, Washington March for Jobs and Freedom. We hear a lot about the freedom part, not so much about jobs part, but the jobs dimension is absolutely central to many of those who made the march possible. Some of the march organizers saw jobs and freedom as inextricably linked. On the same stage as King that day was A. Philip Randolph, the dean of Black activism, who had been struggling for this larger dimension of civil rights for many decades. They joined forces with King. They broadened the demands to jobs and freedom. And Randolph launched the demonstration that day, the march that day, with the words, "Let the nation and the world know the meaning of our numbers. We are not a pressure group. We're not an organization or group of organizations. We are not a mob. We are the advanced guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom." And in his remarks and in speeches that he gave before and after, he made very, very clear that the demands were multifaceted. Yes, civil rights laws. Yes, desegregation and voting rights, but jobs programs, a rise in the minimum wage to provide everyone with a living standard that could sustain them and their families. The economic dimension was absolutely key to what they wanted. The fate of the Negro masses, Randolph said, is linked in the last resort to the fate of the American economy, and the great freedom movement must address itself to the basic problems of this economy if it wishes to find its way out of poverty and despair. If you were going to read one book about the March on Washington, William Jones's The March is the book to read. It provides the long backstory. Much of the complicated organizing is rendered immensely readable. I think it stands out as one of the best of its kind. But let me get to some dissension within the ranks. John Lewis was present that day. He is head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He takes to the microphone. "We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. Hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here today, for they have no money for transportation. They're receiving starvation or no wages at all. It is true that we come with a great sense of misgiving. We support the administration's civil rights bill with great reservations." And he lists his various thoughts about that. That's what he said. That's not what he wanted to say on that day. What he didn't say, and what he was not permitted to say by other march organizers, I think is more important than what he actually said. The original draft goes like this: "In good conscience, we cannot support the Civil Rights Bill, for it's too little too late. There's not one thing in the bill that will protect our people from police brutality. We are in a serious revolution. This nation is still a place of cheap political leaders who have built their careers on immoral compromises and ally themselves with open forms of political, economic, and social exploitation. I want to know, which side is the federal government on? The revolution is at hand. Okay, didn't say that. That section was censored out of the speech at the last minute when the Catholic Archbishop of Washington, another March speaker and backer, refused to participate if Lewis read from his prepared text. And in a room inside the Lincoln Memorial, the speech was quickly rewritten and the hottest sections were removed. Black leaders, moderate leaders from the NAACP, the Urban League, and others were more concerned with winning the administration's support and with the passage of a civil rights bill in Congress. And toward that end, they were willing to curb signs of what they saw as excessive militancy. But on the front lines, SNCC activists were less and less willing to abide by the advice and recommendations of the administration, much less willing to tolerate its foot dragging, its stalling, its watered down commitment to the movement. So behind the scenes, at this moment that appeared to be so unified, there were fracture lines that were visible to those who were looking, and those fracture lines would only increase over time. My own time is fairly limited, so you're going to get the shortened and sped up version of what could be, as I said, a 14-week course, but I won't try your patience on that. The Civil Rights Movement targets Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, one of the more segregated and violent communities in the United States. And their immediate proponent was Eugene Bull Connor, notorious for the brutality of his police force, which constituted a kind of state within a state within, quote unquote, his, Connor's, Birmingham. And Connor was, to some degree, one of the things that attracted civil rights activists to Birmingham. They knew how he would respond. They knew that he would respond to peaceful protest with violence. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the goals was to trigger favorable news coverage to force the hand of the federal government. Only the federal government, they reasoned, could bring about the changes required. Bull Connor accommodated him. He played the role that was scripted for him in helping the movement achieve their goals. Pictures, movie clips of peaceful protesters being thrown against the wall by the pressure of water cannons or being mauled by German shepherds were broadcast across the country, and they sickened the general liberal public. And there were demonstrations. 10,000 people marched on the Boston Common. 100,000 people marched in San Francisco. Thousands of letters and telegrams were sent to Washington, D.C. From liberals appalled by what they were seeing. And in the end, there was an agreement of sorts, with Birmingham's business leaders and elected officials giving into some of the demonstrators' demands, beginning to dismantle the edifice of segregation. President Kennedy took the occasion, went to television. He embraced the Civil Rights Bill that would extend equal rights to all citizens. And he did so in fairly powerful words. So it was a victory for the civil rights movement. But President Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, and his successor, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, a Texas Democrat, made it his job, his mission, to pass as a commemoration to President Kennedy, a civil rights bill. And he pressed Congress very hard for it. The battle was hard fought. White Southerners dug in their heels. They filibustered the bill. They argued against it. It was a long and vigorous fight, the longest filibuster in the history of the United States, some 75 days. But in the end, they lose. The act is passed. Johnson signs it. The Civil Rights Act is a genuinely historical watershed moment. What did the bill do? A great deal. It was perhaps the most far-reaching piece of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, one historian said. It put an end to separate but equal facilities. It prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin in public accommodations of every kind, quote unquote, virtually everywhere. And it authorized the Justice Department to file suits to help desegregate schools and colleges. It creates an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to deal with issues of employment discrimination, which it banned in large places of employment and in trade unions, which practice discrimination in many, many instances. It was an important turning point for the nation, for Johnson, for the civil rights movement, and the Democratic Party. But Johnson believed that in so signing this bill, he had delivered the South to the Republican Party for a very long time to come. And one could argue that this was not an inaccurate prediction of what was to take. And to make a very long story short, SNCC activists continued their efforts to challenge the disfranchisement of Southern Black voters, focusing on Mississippi, attempting to create a kind of a confrontation that would draw in the federal government to do even more than the Civil Rights Act of '64. In the summer of '64, they brought in large numbers of white students, recognizing that the nation paid more attention to white suffering than it did Black suffering. And indeed, there was plenty of suffering all around. 3 civil rights activists are found dead, killed by white Southern racists that summer. The activists work with locals in Mississippi to create the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to challenge the segregationist, lily white Democratic Party in their state. And they run their own kind of freedom elections, not legally sanctioned, but demonstrating that Black Mississippians want the franchise, want to use it. They go to the Democratic National Convention in 1964, seeking to oust, to replace the white Democratic, all-white Democratic delegation. And they capture public headlines. Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the representatives of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, is spellbinding in her recounting of the violence that was brought down upon her personally and those she worked with by Southern whites seeking to deprive them of the ability to register to vote. Lyndon Johnson is extremely angry that she is capturing these headlines, but in the end, Johnson gets his way and they don't. That's a long story for another day. But this contributes to a sense of disillusionment with liberal Democrats and helps to push SNCC and other groups like CORE more in the direction of Black power, a phrase that will break on the scene loudly, publicly in 1966. The movement also targets voting rights in 1965, going after Selma, Alabama. It has but a fraction, a very small fraction of its Black residents registered to vote. But the bottom line was, by shining a spotlight on Selma, they hoped to force the federal government's hand to get it to intervene to promote voting rights legislation. And part of the attraction of Selma was not only its segregation and its disfranchisement, but the fact that it had its own version of Bull Connor in Sheriff Jim Clark. They counted on him to behave as Bull Connor did, and he did not disappoint. As one nearby city newspaper put it, Clark's deputies with their clubs and electric cattle prods became a symbol of resistance to the Negro community and brought charges of harassment and brutality. He played his part well. Demonstrations led to hundreds of arrests, widespread police brutality, and as King put it, Clark was brutalizing, intimidating, harassing, and trampling over Black residents of Selma, and it was broadcast to much of the nation. And the climax came when protesters sought to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge onto Highway 80, the Jefferson Davis Highway, to march from Selma to Alabama's capital, Montgomery, 54 miles away. The result was a massacre of sorts, with police attacking marchers, tear gassing them, beating them from horseback, bludgeoning them. For the national television audience, a British journalist noted later, it seemed like a nightmarish dramatization of the brutal Southern resistance to dignified, nonviolent Black protest. And if you want to read something about this and the backstory to it, SNCC activist turned congressman John Lewis authored a number of graphic novels called March. I confess I was a bit skeptical when I first picked it up to do a book review of it for the American Historical Review, but I was absolutely entranced. I was won over, and I think this is an absolutely powerful book that can be read by adults and by younger people alike. I recommend it highly to you. The long story short, Johnson rises to the occasion. He uses the violence in Selma to call on Congress to pass powerful voting rights legislation. And he does so in a way that moves, in some cases to tears, a number of civil rights activists. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is signed of August before a group of supporters. What did it do? It outlawed the myriad practices that Southern voting registrars used to deny Black Americans the franchise. It allowed the government to send in examiners to the South with the full power of the government to, quote, safeguard the registration and voting of Black Southerners. And the impact was undeniable. Between 64 and 69, the percentage of adult males who registered to vote in the South skyrocketed. And within only a handful of years, the number of Black elected officials increased substantially. The overt, blatant, unrepentant racism that marked so much of public politics now became illegitimate, as white candidates now needed at times to appeal to Black voters for their electoral support. The tone of Southern politics softened to a degree for a while. So by 1965, I would argue, and I will begin to conclude now, the civil rights movement had completed a central part of its historic mission of destroying legalized segregation and ending the legal restrictions on Black voting rights. Its victories assumed legislative form with the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. Absolutely critical. I am going to stop now. There's a lot more that I could say. As I said, if I had 4 to 5 lecture sessions or a full 14 weeks to talk about this, I could go into much more. We could perhaps talk upon what the revolution does not accomplish and the challenges to it in later years. But I am going to, at this point, stop the share and open up for your questions, your observations, your challenges. I invite you to jump into the conversation with questions or comments.
Well, Eric, I think one thing for sure is we could definitely use part 2 on this. To cover some of the things that you weren't able to cover. That was very, very good.
Thank you.
Come on, folks, be brave, ask questions.
Professor, this was the first time that I actually heard about the speech that Congressman Lewis said was redacted. I wasn't aware of that.
It appears in John Lewis's memoir, and it appears in the book by On the March on Washington by Will Jones, and in many accounts of the civil rights movement. It's not one of the things that gets taught, I think, in most school accounts of it. And I offer the example, as do others, to suggest, just how frustrated so many frontline activists were by 1963. They're on the verge, well, they don't quite know this, but they're on the verge of winning a significant civil rights bill. But in their eyes, it's limited. The federal government is compromised. It has been compromising, for decades and decades and decades. They are no fans of the Kennedy Justice Department. They are burned out. And in this case, John Lewis is encouraged to rewrite those sections. But when he goes home, when he goes back to the front lines, that frustration remains. And it's manifested in the Selma campaign, where activists are quite not fond of what King is doing at times. They see him kind of flying in, flying out while they're on the front lines taking it. And by this point, their disillusionment with the government is quite heavy.
I agree. I think, I mean, at the end, it was a compromise, but for the greater good, right? So.
Yes, but this is what historians get to do. We, on the one hand, on the other, because I'm not on the front lines, I'm studying it. I'm trying to understand how different parties are seeing. So from the perspective of someone like A. Philip Randolph, who had been working on these issues for far longer than these young activists have been alive, for people like King, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, this is a moment of tremendous possibility. They finally got the government's attention. They finally have the Kennedy administration verbally committing to something that they have been pushing for years now. And so they're getting close. And so they want to maintain kind of open lines of communication with the administration. And in the end, they get a significant bill. It's tremendous. I have to make this point to my students, who live in a world where race is in the headlines and pessimism is quite evident. And I get to kind of play the old conservative, well, the old historian, who says, yes, things can be bad today, but they are very different than they were 50 plus years ago. And the Civil Rights Act was tremendous in what it accomplished. And yes, it didn't accomplish everything. You still needed a Voting Rights Act, and even that didn't accomplish everything. But to the folks on the front line who are getting beaten on a regular basis, it doesn't feel like enough.
Thank you. Claudia Colvin had actually sat on a bus some 9 months before, and history almost forgot her. But your portrayal was so accurate that there were these different players and there were different dynamics, and there were so many people that were participating. King actually was, parachuted in, parachuted out, but that was by design. But the real groundwork was doing things like there's a Peterson that was also a significant part of the movement. King gets all the glory, gets all the grandeur. And I'm glad you brought Congressman John Lewis's speech, because a lot of people are unaware of how militant that gentleman was in his youthful days. Thank you very much. I appreciate your contributions.
Thank you. I will say there were several people who were arrested for not relinquishing their seats in Montgomery. And there was a kind of a complex dynamic, at play, in that if the person who has been arrested, does not look as respectable as you might, and I put that in quotation marks, then maybe this is not the best case if they will drag their reputation. And so with Rosa Parks, they had someone with a sterling community reputation. Historians, have been critical of, local leaders in Montgomery for, being influenced by the politics of respectability that led them to pass over Colvin and others. But that is a dynamic at play, at least in those years.
And that was the same battle that they had with Plessy versus Ferguson. That there was a whole body of people who thought that Plessy, that they shouldn't have made that move at that time, and it would actually set them back. So it's a similar situation playing out until Rosa Parks plays the card.
But you can find examples scattered throughout many histories. And, with digitization, you can go through various newspapers very quickly. There are a lot of people who don't give up their seat in a lot of places over the course of the 20th century. There's a terrific biography of Pauli Murray, who in the late 30s, gets into trouble violating segregation statutes on a bus in Virginia. But there are cases that nobody is really assembled. But Parks is by no means the first. But these other cases just, for whatever reason, didn't trigger something. maybe because they occurred in earlier periods and there wasn't the spotlight or the same kind of context that I tried to establish. But there are a lot of people doing a lot of protesting in a lot of places in the North and in the South for much of the 20th century. It doesn't add up to a movement always or usually, but examples of that resistance, can be found.
Yeah, our sister Coley Clark, who was executive secretary to brother down in Mississippi that got killed,
Edgar Evers?
Medgar Evers. She said that there were over 250 such resistance movements before Rosa Parks, and things happen for a reason. No television, no Volcana. And also, Montgomery was, not Montgomery, but Birmingham was also a hotbed of communists and so forth, playing in the background. It had a strong union component with the steel mills and so forth like that. So I think there's a body of seasoning that led to it being able to metastasize or gel and come to a better outcome.
Yes, and in Birmingham, when people wind up in jail and they need to be bailed out, where does that bail money come from? In many cases from trade unions.
Mm-hmm.
So the steelworkers, which was not the most progressive union in the country, nonetheless, had suitcases of cash that they delivered to get these people out of jail after they were arrested. And one point made earlier about King kind of flying in, flying out, by design. There is a line in one of Taylor Branch's, I think it's the third volume of the King years, in which he talks about Martin Luther King Jr.'s war on sleep, which I love that phrase. I mean, the guy is just constantly in motion. And I get tired just reading about his schedule. I can't imagine what living it might have been, but he's out there drumming up support and he's raising money. And it's absolutely critical, for these local campaigns, cash is important. And his role was both to popularize, to keep this in the public mind, and to raise funds, that these local folks needed. But at the same time, the fact that he's not always there on the ground, and they're the ones who are carrying out these activities on a day-to-day basis, does create friction and does create resentment, certainly by 63, 64, and definitely by 65. But King's role is absolutely indispensable.
Yeah. Well, they went to get him. He didn't choose this. He was chosen for this. There are players in the movement that said we needed to have this voice. And they went and got him to come and be that voice. So somebody recognized him. For
yes. Absolutely. He was a newcomer to Montgomery at that time. And so, he hadn't made enemies. And so he seemed to be a good choice to kind of rope into this role. And I don't think that people understood just how powerful he would be. And then he opened his mouth, and then it was very evident that he could mobilize people with his words and the power of the images that he brought to mind.
Yeah, but it also, the role of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I think it would be nice for people to hear some of the other speeches, because I think so much of it is downplayed. Bayard Rustin's work is downplayed because he was gay, I guess, being a part of it. But the role of the labor unions and the labor movement in that march is phenomenal.
So that's where the Will Jones book excels. And so he's making the case that Black trade unionists from the get-go are the driving force behind the March on Washington. It's the Negro American Labor Council Committee. Randolph is the head of it. Rustin is a key player in it. But it's their organizational efforts that that make the march a possibility, and then King is the add-on as their efforts are taking place. Rustin is a fantastically interesting figure. He is now getting his due. There are a number of biographies about him. There's a documentary about him as well. But he is a African-American pacifist who is active with CORE in the 1940s. He works with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He is imprisoned during World War II as a conscientious objector. He's involved in the campaign to desegregate the armed forces in the late 1940s. He is brought in the mid 50s. He's dispatched by his New York allies who say, go to Montgomery and meet this guy King and talk to him about nonviolence. So he's kind of a transmission belt and a kind of a living link between different generations and different philosophies. But he's a master organizer. And in 1963, he's the guy who runs the ground game for the March on Washington until his being gay becomes an issue, and certain organizers try to push him out. Randolph, is the director, and they say, you can do whatever you want. And he says, fine, I'm making him my assistant. So Baird, go off and organize this thing.
Right.
And he pulls that off beautifully.
Yeah, great.
Anybody else? Question, comment?
Hi, everybody. Hi, this is Don, Philadelphia. How you doing, Professor Arnesen?
Very good, thanks.
Good. You talked about the Voting Rights Act as being so critical in 1965, and now we've had another attempt to try to block this, voting problem that has been caused. How do we get another Voting Rights Act, or what do we need to do to kind of reinvigorate, to make sure people get a chance to vote and not be disenfranchised?
Well, this is something that I think others of you on this Zoom call can weigh in on, but the Democrats can't hold the Senate by the margin that they do. There's a couple of Democratic senators who are gumming up all sorts of things. The filibuster has got to go. The next election cycle is going to absolutely be critical. And it's a somewhat depressing and not good situation.
Yeah, I agree. We don't need another Voting Rights Act. We've got one. It's there, but it's being torn apart, picked apart, and we just have to get behind it the same way that they did, including some, interestingly, groups of Teamster women really got behind pushing that in 1965. We need to do the same thing and say, no, you cannot take this away from us. Clearly, it is still an important piece of legislation. A lot of people are saying we don't need it anymore. Well, we need it more now than ever, I think. And so we, as a block of people who understand, need to get behind this and make sure that it's not tossed aside, that it's not torn apart, that it is not filibustered out of existence, because without it, we're in big trouble, because all of those things that we fought against will start to seep and then overflow into everything else. So, if nothing else that you take away from this and all the work that was done by the modern civil rights movement, understand it's not over. And if you let things get dusty and fragile, you can lose it. So we have to fight just as hard today as they did in 1965, 64, in order to maintain this. We're not at the period now where everybody gets it and, oh, it's going to be fine. We're very far from that point. So we can't give up.
Well, the mere fact that it's an act instead of a law,
Exactly.
big divide.
Exactly.
Right there. So same with the Civil Rights Act, they're not laws, they're renewable acts, and they're always voting to make change to it. So
you're exactly right. It should not be an act that has to be voted on all the time. It should be a permanent piece of the law.
Right, but the Supreme Court, so the act is still in existence. The Supreme Court gutted certain aspects of it, and then there was a movement. But what it says is we have to ask ourselves about, what it is that we believe in as a nation, right? And then the question then now becomes, what role does the union play in making its voice heard? Because if you think about it, the election of Warnock and Assoff allowed us to get passage of the Bush-Lewis Act, or the American Rescue Plan, which had the Bush-Lewis Act. So it tells you the importance of having a motivated and activated Black voter group, right? So that they're registered to vote and that they have to get them to the polls. And that's going to be very critical in this midterm. And the union has got to play a very dynamic role and a very important role and a very activist role if we are going to protect voting rights. Because, you know, you got to understand that these voting rights bills, so I can understand as a Black man that they're doing it in Georgia and Alabama, but why are you doing it in Idaho and Montana? So the suppression of the vote is not just against Black people, it's against the working class. Yeah. We need to expand the conversation so that all people understand that this is not just about the canary dying in the mine, because when the canary dies in the mine, I hate to tell you what happened to the miners.
Yeah.
Yes, if voting rights weren't important, Republicans would not be trying as hard as they are to take them away.
Yep. Okay, well, this has been a very good discussion. I want to thank Eric, Dr. Arnesen, for being with us here today. I'm hoping that we can convince him to do another segment on this, maybe as a discussion circle on some of the things that we have discussed here today. But again, I thank all of you who joined us. I know it's hard to give up your Sunday, especially when the weather's getting a little bit better. But thank you for joining us. I will say that our next presentation like this is going to be on March 6th, and that will be discussing women's history. That will be presented by yours truly. So if you're sick of hearing me, please come on anyway, because I will have some interesting stuff to talk about women's history, not just in the Teamsters, but across the board in terms of the music that inspired the feminist movement. That is going to be the center of the talk. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope to see you all on the 6th. And with that, I bid you a good day. Eric and folks stay on for a second after.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone take care.
Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You are
Really
welcome.
appreciate
Thanks
it.
for joining us. Okay, Eric, that was great.
Thanks.
You know, you got off on some side things that I thought were fascinating. I wish we would have had more time for you to be able to explore some of that. That's why I suggested a part 2, because I think
Sure.
that people were very engaged just based on some of the questions and stuff afterwards. So I thought that was really great. Anybody else comment? Eric, I had a couple of requests. People would like a copy of the PowerPoint. Are you up for that?
Let me clean it up and see if I can reduce the file size, because it's like the version that I didn't actually fully give is like 140 slides.
Well, that's okay though, because do you have Dropbox?
Google Drive. I'll figure out something.
Because you can just put it to me on Dropbox, and then I can put it on jump drives and send it to those who have asked for it. And then also, if you want to put the shortened version up, I'll put it into a PDF form, and then we can email it.
Great. Well, take care.
Perfect. Okay, I'll be in touch with you Monday, Tuesday. We'll figure that stuff out.
Good, thanks.
And Karen, let me know if you need us to do anything on that. We'll be
Okay, that'd be
glad to
great.
help in on
I
that.
don't use Google Drive, so I always use Dropbox. So that's why I was like,
We'll make it work.
okay. All right, great. Anybody else comment?
Eric, that was great as usual. And also, I know that you responded to the email. Local 572 wanted to do something. So closer it gets to that, then we'll work on logistics.
Where are they based?
In California.
Great, and that's
That's in California.
I'm available.
Yeah, 572 is Rick Middleton is the principal officer. And it's a really good active role. So that'd be great.
Good. All right.
Oh,
Okay.
someone put in the chat that I want to bring up that I thought will be a good idea that we can explore in the future. So usually with all of these programs, there's some sort of book that we discuss, but Stuart, who's an SRC, suggested that like maybe we have, some book club discussion or discussions around the books that we read. So people aren't just reading them on their own, but we're coming back to have a discussion about them.
I would
think that's
love
pretty,
to,
yeah.
I would love to do that because there
Yeah.
were books that you posted up. Part of the reason I want a copy of the PowerPoint is because there were books in there. I was like, I never.
I was going to get that to you early this week as well. I just pull those out and PDF them, and so everyone can see the covers. I did that last time, and I will do it this time.
Okay, that'd be great. But Anthony, I agree with you. I think some sort of discussion on some of these books would be fabulous.
Yeah, and it would be like a, training and development HRDC book club type situation that we could do. Yeah, to follow up on these programs. I think that'd be really, really great.
I think that would be great. And I think, we might not get a huge amount of people, but the people that we would get would be the folks that are really interested. And then they'll, segue out to their members, and then we'll start getting more members. That,
Right.
that always works. So that'd be great.
Okay, yeah, so I'll put that in one of the notes and we'll just develop that as we get back into the office.
Terrific.
Yep.
All right. Take care, everyone.
All right,
All
thank
right,
you guys.
thanks,
Have a
guys.
great Sunday.
Thanks.
Okay,
Bye.
you too.
Bye.